What happens when a military brags about total control and then loses everything in one night?
Iran said the Strait of Hormuz belonged to them. By morning, half their coastline was on fire, and the world was asking a very different question. Before we go further, if you want to see exactly how this played out, minute by minute, hit, like right now, it costs nothing and it tells me you want the full story. Subscribe if you're new, and if this video grabs you, send it to one person who still thinks Iran can actually shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Let's get into it. For years, Iranian commanders stood in front of cameras and made the same promise. They said the Strait of Hormuz was theirs. They said American ships crossed those waters only because Iran allowed it. Generals talked about total control, about mines waiting on the seabed, about missile batteries hidden along every ridge from Bandar Abbas to the tip of the Musandam Peninsula. For years, nobody tested that claim in the open. This time, someone did. The strait itself is barely 20 miles wide at its narrowest point. A fifth of the planet's oil moves through that gap every single day. Whoever controls it controls a piece of the global economy, and Iran built its entire coastal defense strategy around that one fact. Small missile boats, truck-mounted anti-ship batteries tucked into caves and palm groves, radar sites perched on ridgelines with clear sight lines over the shipping lanes. On paper, it looked like a wall of steel guarding a choke point. In practice, it was about to be tested against the most experienced navy on Earth.
Think about what it actually takes to build a claim like total control. It isn't one weapon, it's dozens of small positions scattered across hundreds of miles of coastline, each one depending on the others to hold the line.
A missile boat here, a radar dish there, a truck launcher hidden under netting 3 ridges over. On a map, all those dots look like a net thrown across the water. But a net is only as strong as its weakest knot, and nobody outside Iran's own command structure really knew how strong those knots were. That question was about to get answered in public, in real time, in front of the entire world. The trigger was simple. Iranian batteries had already fired on commercial tankers twice that week, setting 2 ships ablaze in the open lanes. American destroyers patrolling the strait had been watching every launch, every radar sweep, every truck movement for days.
When Iranian crews prepared to fire on a third tanker, the destroyers were already locked on. What followed wasn't a warning shot. It was a response that had been building since the first missile left an Iranian launcher.
Picture the scene. Late afternoon, the sun dropping toward the water, haze sitting low over the strait the way it always does in summer. An Iranian missile crew on the southern coast finishes its targeting solution on a tanker crawling through the lanes. They believe they have minutes to spare.
They don't. 2 American destroyers sitting southeast of the strait have already locked their fire control radar onto that exact position, and within seconds, the forward decks of both ships erupt in fire.
This is where the story really turns, because what launched from those ships wasn't a single missile. It was 12, fired in under 2 minutes, using a system most people have never heard of, but that decides naval wars before they even start. It's called the Mark 41 vertical launch system, and it's the reason a single American destroyer can throw more firepower in 90 seconds than some entire navies carry in their whole fleet. Each destroyer carries dozens of missile cells built into the deck, arranged in modules of 8 around a central armored exhaust duct. When a missile fires, the flame doesn't stay trapped inside its own tube. It vents up through that shared duct, which means a missile can launch 3 feet from another fully loaded cell without setting it off. That's the quiet engineering trick nobody talks about. It's not just about carrying missiles, it's about carrying them safely enough to fire 12 in 100 seconds without the ship tearing itself apart. Once launched, those missiles aren't just flying in a straight line hoping to get lucky. Tomahawk cruise missiles fly a pre-planned route, mapped out mile by mile before they ever leave the deck. In the final stretch, an onboard camera compares what it sees below to images loaded before launch, matching landmarks like a driver checking a map against the road ahead.
That's how a missile fired from open water finds one specific building on a coastline 170 miles away, without a single human steering it in real time. Stop and picture what that actually means for the people on the receiving end. A missile crew 170 miles away isn't hiding from a soldier with a rifle. They're hiding from a machine that already knows exactly what their position looks like from 3 different angles, loaded into memory before the missile ever left its tube. Distance used to be the best defense a military position could ask for. Against this kind of guidance, distance barely slows anything down. It just adds a few extra minutes to the flight. But here's where it gets interesting, because while the American missiles were already in the air, Iranian crews further inland were still waiting. The Ghadir battery, Iran's homegrown anti-ship missile system, had a tanker in its sights and a firing solution ready to go. The only thing missing was permission from command in Bandar Abbas. On previous days, that approval had taken up to 30 minutes to arrive. This time, the clock never got to finish. That delay says everything about how Iran's coastal defense actually worked. It wasn't really designed for speed.
Batteries could track a target for as long as they wanted, but nobody could pull the trigger without checking in with higher command first. In a fight measured in minutes, that habit would turn out to be fatal. Meanwhile, on a ridge overlooking the strait, an Iranian surveillance crew stared at an empty radar screen.
4 days of American strikes had already crawled up the coastline toward them, and the silence on their scope felt less like safety and more like waiting for a door to open.
What they didn't fully account for was a basic fact of physics. Radar travels in a straight line, but the Earth curves away beneath it. A missile flying low over the water stays hidden behind that curve until it's roughly 25 miles out. At cruise missile speed, that gives a defender less than 3 minutes of warning. And those 3 minutes aren't a gift. They're simply what's left once the planet runs out of places for a threat to hide. Worse, the sea itself works against radar operators hunting low-flying targets. A radar beam skimming the surface picks up 2 signals for every incoming missile, the missile itself and its own reflection bouncing off the waves.
Add wind chop and swell, and the missile all but disappears into the clutter. It's the reason sea-skimming missiles have humiliated navies for decades. You're not just hunting a target, you're hunting a shadow hiding inside its own reflection. If you're starting to see how one-sided this fight actually was, that's the point, and it only gets more lopsided from here. Drop a like if this is blowing your mind so far, and stick around, because the next part is where Iran's entire coastal defense collapses in real time. 10 Tomahawks flattened into formation and turned toward the southern coast of Keshem Island, while 2 more peeled off on a longer, separate path.
Remember those 2, because they matter later. The 10 on the direct route covered 170 miles in about 19 minutes, roughly the time it takes to drive between 2 mid-sized cities. Except this drive was happening over open water at cruise missile speed.
On the hillside above the coast, Iranian crews manning a Gadir anti-ship battery had everything ready. Launcher aimed, radar solution loaded, truck-mounted missiles waiting for a single word from command.
That word never came fast enough. This battery worked by having a truck fire without ever locating the target itself. The radar sight on the ridge fed it 4 numbers, a predicted position, and the missile flew blind toward where the target would be in a few minutes, only switching on its own guidance system in the final stretch. It's a clever system when it works, but it depends entirely on the ridge radar staying alive and staying accurate. Neither one held up. 2.5 minutes before impact, radar returns cleared the horizon on the island, and phones started ringing across every command post at once. The kind of moment where several people realized the same terrible thing in the same second. A sergeant grabbed a field line to the ridge. It was already busy. 2.5 minutes sounds like enough time until you actually try to use it. A radar has to build a track. A launcher has to spin up from cold. Crews standing outside smoking have to sprint back to their seats. None of that fits inside 150 seconds, and this crew was about to learn that the hard way. The only weapon on that stretch of coast, actually ready to fire in real time, was the oldest one there, an anti-aircraft gun designed in the 1960s. Towed behind a truck, aimed by a man's eyes and a set of iron sights. Against a helicopter, it's respectable. Against a cruise missile, crossing at more than 800 feet per second, the math turns brutal.
By the time a shell reaches a mile out, the missile has already moved a quarter mile further. The gunner wasn't shooting at a target.
He was shooting at where a target used to be, and every gunner in history who's tried that against a fast mover has lost. 90 seconds later, the hillside stopped functioning as a military position entirely. One warhead tore the radar tower off its mount. Others hit the launcher trucks and the reload site, where stored missile boosters started igniting each other in a chain of secondary explosions rolling across the ridge. None of this equipment was armored against anything heavier than shrapnel. A missile battery isn't a bunker, it's hydraulics, cabling, and a radar dish standing in the open, and 1,000 pounds of blast fragmentation doesn't need to punch through anything. It just needs to throw steel at everything soft nearby, and almost everything on that hillside qualified. Explosions rolled across the water all the way to Bandar Abbas, where people on the street stopped and checked their watches. In the space of about 10 minutes, what Iran had called its premier coastal defense position on that stretch of coastline stopped being a threat to anyone. Out on the open water, the tanker that had been targeted all afternoon kept moving at the same steady speed, its crew never fully understanding how close they'd come or why nothing ever fired at them. The 2 remaining Tomahawks, the ones on the longer route, were headed somewhere else entirely, chasing a target that had already learned to run. Because not every Iranian unit made the same mistake twice. Hours earlier, a mobile missile battery near a site called Suza had packed up, gone dark, and driven away the moment reconnaissance aircraft passed overhead. Shoot and scoot, the oldest survival trick in mobile warfare, and for a while it worked. A photograph only describes where something used to be. The real fight was about closing the gap between that photograph and the missile meant to use it. That's where an aircraft most people have never heard of enters the story. High above the strait, a drone the size of a small airliner had been circling since noon, well within range of the exact missile systems it was hunting. This is a level of risk the crew flying it understood completely, because Iran had shot one of these down before, back in 2019, destroying a surveillance aircraft worth over $100 million in a single hit.
Flying that same orbit again wasn't recklessness, it was necessity. Somebody had to be watching the moment those missing trucks moved again, and eventually they did.
Coordinates came down through a satellite link. 5 trucks tucked under palm trees near the island's center hadn't been there that morning. What gave them away wasn't the trucks themselves, hidden well enough under the canopy, but the spacing between them. A real air defense battery can't park randomly. Radar vehicles need open sky. Launchers need separation, so one explosion doesn't take out the others. That specific pattern is dictated by physics, not habit, and it looks the same no matter which country is running the system. You can hide the vehicles. You can't hide the shape they're forced to sit in. This is the part most people miss when they imagine modern warfare. It isn't really about who has the bigger missile or the thicker armor. It's about who can keep watching without ever needing to blink. A satellite passes overhead every few hours and takes a snapshot, useful but limited. A drone holding a slow circle at 50,000 feet for an entire day is a completely different kind of threat, because it doesn't just take a picture, it builds a pattern. It learns when trucks move, where they tend to stop, how long crews take to set up and tear down. Hiding from a single photograph is easy. Hiding from something that's been quietly studying your habits since sunrise is a different problem entirely, and it's one most mobile batteries were never designed to solve.
That's also why holding that orbit mattered so much, and why the crew flying it accepted the risk without hesitation.
Every minute spent circling above the strait was a minute spent inside the reach of the exact weapons capable of shooting it down. Everyone involved knew the history. Losing that kind of aircraft isn't just expensive. It's a gap in coverage at the exact moment coverage matters most. Somebody had to keep watching anyway, because the second that orbit broke, 5 hidden trucks under a palm canopy would have simply vanished back into uncertainty, and the whole hunt would have started over from nothing. If this story is starting to feel like a chess match where one side doesn't even know the rules changed, you're exactly right. And the next part is where it gets settled for good. If you're enjoying this breakdown, share it with someone who still thinks old school hiding tactics beat modern surveillance, because what happens next proves they don't. 2 Tomahawks, the ones that had taken the longer route earlier, banked hard and steadied onto a new heading toward that palm grove. This is possible because modern Tomahawks aren't fire and forget weapons anymore. They carry a satellite link built into their spine, letting a human retarget them mid-flight, hold them in a loop offshore, or redirect them entirely, right up until the missile physically runs out of fuel to make the turn. Older cruise missiles were like a sealed letter, delivered exactly where it was addressed and nowhere else. This generation is more like a driver you can call mid-trip and send somewhere new, as long as there's still enough gas in the tank to get there. That window wasn't unlimited. Every course correction burns fuel, and somewhere on a targeting officer's screen there was a hard line, a point past which no new coordinates could reach the palm grove because the missile simply wouldn't have the range left. Both routes got replotted just inside that limit.
One missile came in low and direct off the water. The other, forced by fuel constraints, had to cross over the island itself to make the geometry work. In the palm grove, the Iranian commander felt the explosions from the ridge before he heard them, the shockwaves arriving through the ground a beat ahead of the sound. He gave the only order that made sense: radar on for short bursts only, then off again, blinking instead of staying lit, because a radar that transmits continuously is a radar, broadcasting its own coordinates to anyone listening. On the third burst, his crew caught something, a small, low, fast contact skimming in off the water. What fired back was genuinely impressive. A Syed interceptor, Iran's most capable homegrown system, leapt off its rail and covered the distance to the coast in under half a minute, reaching speeds around 4 times the speed of sound. Unlike the anti-aircraft gun on the ridge, this missile didn't need direct contact. Its proximity fuse read the closing distance and detonated close enough to shred the incoming Tomahawk with fragments, and the missile coming in off the water came apart in a spray of burning fuel. For a moment, it looked like Iran had actually won a round. But that single shot cost something enormous. Guiding that interceptor meant the Iranian radar had to keep staring seaward, continuously transmitting for the better part of 90 seconds, and the second Tomahawk wasn't coming from the sea anymore. It had already crossed the coastline miles away and was flying low over rooftops and tree lines, buried in exactly the kind of ground clutter that makes inland targets far harder to track than anything over open water. For that radar to catch it, it needed to swing away from the ocean and start scanning inland immediately. It never got the chance. 60 seconds later, the second Tomahawk came in low over a ridge east of the grove and struck the radar system directly, tearing it apart before it could even finish rotating. The fireball climbed through the palm trees. Launch trucks rocked on their suspensions, and the crew that had been celebrating their successful intercept only a minute earlier were suddenly diving for cover.
Here's the part that really matters. That one hit didn't destroy every missile in that grove. 2 loaded launcher trucks survived completely untouched. But without the radar that told them where to look, those remaining missiles were now just very expensive metal tubes sitting in a field. You don't need to destroy an entire battery to defeat it. You just need to take out the one piece that lets it see, and everything else becomes useless on its own. Before we go further into what this actually means, quick favor. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about how this stuff really works, not just the headlines. Smash that like button, it helps this channel more than you'd think. And drop a comment telling me which system surprised you most, the old anti-aircraft gun, the Sayed intercept, or the satellite retargeting. I read every single one. By the time the smoke cleared over that stretch of coastline, Iran's boldest coastal defense claim of the year had been tested against real firepower and had lasted less than an hour from the first missile leaving an American deck to the last radar going dark. Total control turned out to mean something very different than the generals promised. It meant a handful of missile batteries scattered along a coastline,
each one only as strong as its slowest radio call to headquarters, each one only as hidden as its last photograph, and each one only as dangerous as the radar dish standing next to it.
What actually happened out there wasn't really about missiles versus missiles. It was about who could see first, decide first, and act first, and in almost every exchange that night, one side simply moved faster than the other could react. American crews didn't win because their missiles were unstoppable. Iranian gunners fought back with real skill and real courage, and at least one interceptor did exactly what it was designed to do. The difference came down to something much less dramatic than raw firepower. It came down to decision-making speed, to satellites that never stopped watching, to a chain of command that could redirect a weapon mid-flight instead of locking it onto a single fixed target the moment it left the rail. That's the real lesson buried inside this whole event, and it's worth sitting with for a second. In modern warfare, the side that has to ask permission before firing is already losing the fight before the first missile leaves the ground. Iran's system depended on a phone call reaching Bandar Abbas and coming back with approval, sometimes taking half an hour to arrive. The American system depended on decisions already made in advance, sensors already watching, and weapons already capable of changing their minds mid-flight. One of those systems was built for a war that moves in hours. The other was built for a war that moves in minutes, and on this particular afternoon, minutes were all that mattered. There's also something worth remembering about the men on both sides of this story, because it's easy to reduce all of this to hardware and forget there were people standing next to every one of these systems. The gunner on the ridge who kept firing his outdated weapon at an impossible target instead of running for the trench behind him. The radar crew who blinked their system on and off, trying to buy their comrades a few extra seconds. The Sayed crew who pulled off one of the hardest intercepts in modern naval warfare, only to lose everything 60 seconds later because the physics of radar don't care how skilled you are. None of them were careless. Most of them did their jobs about as well as anyone could have under that kind of pressure. They were simply operating inside a system that had already lost the fight the moment it decided speed and hardware mattered less than protocol.
On the American side, there's a different kind of story worth noticing too. Nobody on those destroyers celebrated when the last radar site went dark.
There's a strange quiet that settles over a combat information center after a strike like that, because everyone in that room understands exactly what just happened on the other end of those coordinates. Professionals don't cheer explosions. They check the next task on the list because in a night like this, there's always a next task. That kind of discipline, treating a devastating strike as routine work instead of a moment to celebrate, is its own quiet advantage. It means decisions get made without emotion clouding the next call, and in a fight decided by minutes, clear heads move faster than excited ones. It's also worth asking why Iran's command structure worked the way it did in the first place, because it wasn't an accident or a mistake made under pressure. Centralizing every firing decision in Bandar Abbas was a deliberate choice, built to prevent local commanders from escalating a conflict without approval from the top. In peacetime, or in a slow-moving standoff, that caution makes sense. Nobody wants a single overeager crew starting a war nobody planned for. But the same caution that prevents an accidental war becomes a fatal weakness the moment a real war actually starts. The system was built to slow down mistakes. It ended up slowing down survival instead, and there's no rewinding that kind of decision once the missiles are already in the air. Consider, too, how differently this night would have gone if even one piece of that chain had worked faster. If Bandar Abbas had given instant clearance instead of making a battery wait, that tanker might have taken a hit before American missiles ever left the deck. If the ridge radar had caught the incoming Tomahawks even 90 seconds earlier, the anti-aircraft gun might have had a real chance instead of an impossible one. If the mobile battery in the Palm Grove had shut its radar down completely instead of blinking it on and off, both incoming missiles might have arrived with no warning at all, and no interceptor would have gotten off the rail in time. War at this speed doesn't leave room for almost. Every single link either holds or it doesn't, and on this particular night, one side's chain held together while the others kept snapping at the worst possible moments. And that's really what total control turned out to mean when it actually got tested. It wasn't a claim about missiles or radar stations or hidden batteries in palm groves. It was a claim about who truly commanded that stretch of water when the shooting actually started. And for one night in the Strait of Hormuz, the answer wasn't even close. A coastline that Iranian commanders had spent years describing as an unbreakable wall turned out to be a scattered collection of positions, each one isolated, each one slower than the weapons hunting it, each one gone within minutes of the moment it decided to fight back. There's a reason stories like this matter beyond just one night in one strait. Every Navy on the planet is watching how this unfolded, taking notes, updating their own playbooks. The lesson isn't really about Iran specifically. It's about what happens to any military, anywhere, when speed of decision gets sacrificed for control from the top. That lesson doesn't expire, and it doesn't care which flag is flying over the command post. If there's one image that sums up everything that happened that night, it's this. On one side, a battery commander waiting by a radio for permission that arrived too late. On the other side, a missile already redirected mid-flight before that permission was even granted. That gap, the space between a phone call and a decision already made, is the entire story of what happened in the Strait of Hormuz that day. It's the story of why total control was never really in Iran's hands to begin with, and why the world watched a claim about domination collapse into silence in less time than it takes to watch this video twice. Wars like this rarely get decided by the size of an arsenal. They get decided by the size of the gap between seeing a threat and doing something about it. Iran had real weapons, real training, and real courage on that coastline. What it didn't have was a system built to move as fast as the danger it was facing. And when that gap gets exposed in front of the entire world, it doesn't matter how many times a general stood at a podium and promised total control. The water doesn't listen to podiums. It only listens to whoever moves first. If you want to see what happened when Iran's Navy tried the exact same gamble on open water, that story is even more one-sided, and it's waiting for you right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.